The emergency alarm screamed through Concordia Prime like wounded animals. Ambassador Zethkari pressed her scaled hands against the viewing port, staring at the empty space where New Geneva should have been. The human colony had vanished overnight, leaving nothing but cold vacuum and distant stars. "Impossible," she whispered, her translator converting the Velnathi clicking sounds into standard galactic speech. 50 million people don't just disappear. Behind her, the Grand Assembly buzzed with panic. Representatives from 47 different species filled the massive chamber, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of confusion. The crystalline Zethnathi flickered with rapid light patterns. The gaseous Etherians swirled in agitated spirals. Even the usually calm plant-based Verdani rustled their leaves in distress. Council President Mordun slammed his energy staff against the floor. The sound echoed through the chamber, finally bringing some order to the chaos. The massive, bear-like creature stood nearly 3 meters tall, his thick fur rippling with bioluminescent patterns that showed his emotional state. Right now, those patterns displayed deep confusion mixed with growing alarm. "Report," Mordun commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had led the Galactic Council for over 2 decades. Zethkari turned from the viewing port, her reptilian features tight with worry. As the Council's chief investigator, she had seen many strange things in her career, but this was beyond anything in her experience. At exactly 0300 hours standard time, every human settlement, ship, and station in known space went dark, she reported. No distress signals, no emergency broadcasts, no communication of any kind. When our scout ships arrived at human locations, they found empty buildings, abandoned cities, and vacant ships. But everything was left in perfect condition. "Define perfect condition," demanded Hierarch Valketh of Altair Prime. The tall, thin being spoke through a mechanical translator, his natural communication being too high-pitched for most species to hear. "The buildings are intact. The power systems still function. Food remains fresh in refrigerators. But every trace of human DNA, every piece of human technology, every cultural artifact has been removed with surgical precision. It's as if they packed up everything that mattered to them and simply left." The chamber erupted in discussion again. Some voices carried relief, others showed concern, and a few expressed outright celebration. The hierarchs of Altair Prime had never liked humans, considering them too unpredictable and emotional for proper galactic citizenship. "Perhaps this is for the best," Hierarch Valketh announced, his mechanical voice cutting through the noise. Humans were always troublesome. Their constant questioning of established protocols, their refusal to follow proper diplomatic channels, their disturbing habit of befriending dangerous species. His translator clicked with what might have been satisfaction. "The galaxy will be more orderly without them." Several other representatives nodded in agreement. The humans had only joined the Galactic Council 50 years ago, but they had quickly made themselves controversial. They refused to accept that some problems were unsolvable. They ignored warnings about dangerous regions of space, then somehow survived where others had failed. Worst of all, they had a tendency to treat all species as equals, regardless of their technological level or cultural development. "The Kethmori agree," rumbled Ambassador Grixtok, his rocky exterior shifting as he spoke. Humans were disruptive. They made trade negotiations complicated. "Complicated how?" asked Counselor Yilandra, the Council's chief archivist. The insectoid being's compound eyes focused on Grixtok with intense curiosity. They always ask questions. "Why do we charge the Velnathi more for rare metals? Why don't the Etherians have voting rights in mining disputes? Why can't the Suldani access the same trade routes as everyone else?" Grixtok's voice carried irritation. They made simple business difficult. Many representatives murmured agreement. The humans had indeed been difficult trading partners. They seemed to have moral objections to perfectly normal business practices. They insisted on fair prices for all species, regardless of their military strength or political influence. They had even created something called ethical trading standards that many found unnecessarily restrictive. President Mordun raised his staff again. "While the humans' departure may solve certain diplomatic challenges, we must consider the practical implications. They maintain significant infrastructure throughout the galaxy. Infrastructure we can easily replace," declared Hierarch Valketh. Their technology was primitive compared to ours. Their diplomatic methods were crude. Their military tactics were reckless. We are better without them. As if to punctuate his words, an aide rushed into the chamber. The young Velnathi's scales were flushed with excitement and fear. "President Mordun," the aide gasped. "We're receiving reports from the neutral zone. The human defense platforms around the Keth-Mori-Soldani border have shut down. Both sides are mobilizing their fleets." A moment of silence fell over the chamber. The Keth-Mori and Soldani had been in a territorial dispute for over a century. The only thing preventing open warfare was a series of automated defense platforms that the humans had built and maintained. These platforms would disable any ship that entered disputed space with weapons powered, forcing both sides to rely on diplomacy instead of violence. "Surely the platforms can be reactivated," President Mordun said, though his bioluminescent patterns showed growing concern. "No, sir," the aide replied. "The platforms require human genetic markers for activation. They were designed that way as a security measure. Without humans to operate them, they're just expensive metal floating in space." The chamber began to stir with unease. Ambassador Zethkari felt a cold sensation in her stomach. She had helped negotiate the peace agreement that created those platforms. The humans had insisted on the genetic locks, claiming it would prevent the platforms from being turned into weapons. At the time, it had seemed like human paranoia. Now it looked like careful planning. "This is a minor setback," Hierarch Valketh insisted, though his translator's tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as others. "We can develop new peacekeeping methods. Better methods." "Of course," agreed Counselor Trixani of the Hegemony, the energy being flickered with patterns of confidence. "Human methods were always crude. We can surely improve upon them." But even as the representatives spoke with confidence, reports continued to filter in. Human-operated communication relays in distant sectors had gone silent. Trade routes that depended on human navigators were becoming dangerous to travel. Research stations that humans had staffed were sending automated distress signals as their life support systems began to fail without maintenance. President Mordun tried to maintain order, but the reports kept coming. Each new piece of information revealed another system that had depended on human involvement. It was becoming clear that humans had been far more integrated into galactic infrastructure than anyone had realized. "Perhaps," suggested Yolandra quietly, "we should investigate exactly what roles humans were performing before we celebrate their departure." "An excellent idea," President Mordun agreed. "I'm forming an emergency committee to assess the situation. We need to understand what functions humans were performing and how to replace them." But even as he spoke, Zethkari was studying the data from the abandoned human colonies. Something bothered her about the precision of their departure. This wasn't a panicked evacuation. This was a carefully planned withdrawal. The humans had removed exactly what they wanted to take and left exactly what they wanted to leave behind. The question that worried her most was simple. If the humans had planned this so carefully, what else had they planned for? And why did she have the growing feeling that the galaxy was about to find out? 3 days after the humans vanished, the first shots were fired in the Helix Nebula. The conflict between the Keth-Mori and Soldani had escalated from angry words to actual weapons fire in less than 72 hours. What had been a stable peace for over 50 years crumbled without the human-maintained defense platforms to keep both sides separated. Ambassador Zethkari stood in the Council's Emergency Operations Center, watching the tactical displays with growing horror. Red indicators showed combat zones spreading across 3 different sectors. Yellow warnings marked trade routes that had become too dangerous to travel. Most disturbing of all were the blue markers showing critical infrastructure that was beginning to fail without human maintenance. "Casualties?" she asked the duty officer. 14 ships destroyed, approximately 300 lives lost," reported the young Atheran, their gaseous forms swirling with distress patterns. Both sides blamed the other for firing first. "Of course they do," muttered Counselor Yolandra from her position at the main research terminal. The insectoid archivist had been working non-stop since the humans disappeared, trying to understand the full scope of their involvement in galactic affairs. What she was discovering worried her more each hour. "The Keth-Mori and Soldani haven't been able to communicate directly in over 80 years," Yolandra explained to the assembled emergency committee. "Their languages developed on completely different evolutionary paths. The Keth-Mori communicate through mineral-based resonance patterns, while the Soldani use bioelectric field variations. They're completely incompatible." "Then how have they been negotiating?" asked President Mordun. "Humans," Yolanda replied simply. Human translators were the only ones who could interpret both communication methods. They've been mediating every single interaction between these species for decades. The weight of that statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Without human translators, the Kethmori and Soldani couldn't even discuss a ceasefire, let alone negotiate a lasting peace. Surely we can develop translation protocols, suggested Hierarch Valketh, though his mechanical translator carried less confidence than usual. We tried, Yolanda replied, gesturing to her research displays. The quantum processing power required to translate Kethmori mineral resonance into Soldani bioelectric patterns is enormous. Our best computers can manage simple concepts like yes and no, but complex negotiations require intuitive understanding that only biological neural networks seem capable of providing. And humans have the right type of neural networks? President Morden asked. Apparently so. The research I've found suggests that human brains are unusually adaptable. They can learn to interpret communication methods that other species find impossible to understand. While Yolanda spoke, new reports continued arriving. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. A cargo convoy attempting to use the Magellan trade route had been destroyed by gravitic storms. The route had been considered safe for 30 years, but only because human navigators had been secretly updating the safety protocols based on stellar drift calculations. How many trade routes depend on human navigation? President Morden demanded. At least 40% of major commercial shipping lanes, replied the duty officer. Humans were willing to take risks that other species considered suicidal. They mapped routes through unstable regions, asteroid fields, and areas with unusual stellar phenomena. Reckless, snorted Hierarch Valketh. We said they were reckless. Maybe, Yolanda agreed. But their recklessness kept commerce flowing. Without those routes, shipping costs are going to increase by at least 300%. As if summoned by their conversation, Ambassador Trixvel of the Traders Guild burst into the operations center. The energy being's usual calm demeanor was replaced by frantic flickering patterns. Emergency, Trixvel announced. The Sorrow Gates passage has claimed 3 ships. The Merchant Council is demanding answers. Sethkari felt her scales tighten with dread. The Sorrow Gates were a hyperspace passage through one of the most dangerous regions of the galaxy. It cut travel time between the core worlds and the rim by weeks, but navigating it required precise calculations and nerves of steel. Most species considered it too dangerous to attempt. Who was operating the ships? President Morden asked, though Sethkari suspected they all knew the answer. Seth Nauthi crews, Trixvel replied. They were following the standard navigation protocols that have been used for 20 years. Human-designed protocols, Yolanda said quietly. Yes, Trixvel confirmed. The humans created the navigation methods for the Sorrow Gates. They said the passage required intuitive adjustments that couldn't be programmed into computers. We thought they were just being mysterious. Now we realize they were the only ones who could actually make those adjustments work. The room fell silent, except for the constant stream of status updates from the various monitoring stations. Each report brought new evidence of how deeply humans had been integrated into galactic society. Medical emergency on Kepler Station, announced another duty officer. Their biosynthesis labs are experiencing cascading failures. Estimated pharmaceutical shortages within 6 days. Research facility on Proxima 7 reporting critical errors in their quantum computer arrays. All advanced calculations have been suspended. The orbital shipyards at Wolf 359 are requesting emergency assistance. Their automated construction systems are malfunctioning without human oversight. Sethkari moved to the central display, calling up a galactic map. She began marking each location where problems were emerging. The pattern that appeared made her stomach clench with fear. Look at this, she called to the others. Every single crisis point has one thing in common. The assembled representatives gathered around the display. Red markers showed combat zones, yellow indicated infrastructure failures, and orange marked critical shortages. But when Sethkari overlaid the data with human settlement locations, a terrible pattern emerged. They're all places where humans were working, President Morden observed, his bioluminescent patterns showing deep concern. Not just working, Yolanda corrected, studying her research data. Places where humans were performing functions that other species couldn't or wouldn't do. High-risk operations, complex negotiations, dangerous research, precision manufacturing. But why didn't we know? demanded Hierarch Valketh. "How could humans be so essential without us realizing it?" Yolandra's compound eyes focused on her data screens. "Because they never asked for recognition. Look at these records. Humans consistently took jobs that other species refused. They volunteered for dangerous assignments. They solved problems without demanding credit. Half the time, they let other species claim the achievements as their own." "That makes no sense," Trixvel protested. "Why would they hide their contributions?" "Maybe they weren't hiding," Zethkari said slowly, a terrible thought forming in her mind. "Maybe we just weren't paying attention." She pulled up the Council's official records of human contributions to galactic society. The list was surprisingly short, mainly consisting of basic trade agreements and minor technological exchanges. But when she cross-referenced it with actual human activities, a different picture emerged. "The official records show humans as junior partners in most projects," she explained. "But the operational data shows them doing most of the actual work. They designed the safety protocols. They performed the dangerous calculations. They mediated the complex negotiations. But the credit went to senior species who supervised the projects. The implications hung heavy in the air. The humans hadn't just been contributors to galactic civilization. They had been essential to its function. And somehow the rest of the galaxy had convinced itself that human participation was merely helpful, rather than necessary." "How bad is this going to get?" President Mordoon asked quietly. Yolandra studied her data for a long moment before answering. "Based on current failure rates and the scope of human involvement in critical systems, I estimate we have perhaps 2 weeks before major infrastructure collapse begins. After that," she paused, her translator struggling with concepts that had no equivalent in her native language. "After that, we'll discover exactly how much we needed them." Outside the operations center, emergency alerts continued to sound throughout Concordia Prime. The galaxy was beginning to understand what it had lost, but the full scope of the disaster was still unfolding. 2 weeks after the humans vanished, Councillor Veltani of the Hegemony made a discovery that sent shockwaves through the remaining council leadership. Hidden in the diplomatic archives were thousands of documents marked with human security codes, records of conflicts that had never happened, wars that had been prevented before they could begin. They were everywhere, Veltani reported to the emergency session, her energy form flickering with patterns of disbelief. "Every major diplomatic crisis of the past 50 years has human fingerprints on its resolution. Not the official resolutions we recorded, but secret negotiations, back-channel communications, private agreements between hostile species." Ambassador Zethkari studied the documents with growing amazement and horror. The files showed a completely different version of recent galactic history. The trade war of 2387 hadn't ended because of Zeth-Nathi economic pressure, as the official records claimed. It had ended because a human diplomat named Sarah Chen had spent 6 months secretly shuttling between the opposing fleets, finding compromises that both sides could accept without losing face. "Look at this," Zethkari pointed to another file. "The Insectoid Collective's threat to withdraw from the Council in 2391. The official record says they changed their minds after diplomatic pressure from the Altarian hierarchy. But this shows human negotiators working with individual collective queens, addressing their concerns one by one until they agreed to stay." President Morden examined the documents with his massive hands, his bioluminescent patterns showing confusion and growing alarm. "Why didn't they tell us about this work? Why conduct secret diplomacy?" "Because we wouldn't have let them," Veltani replied grimly. "Look at these communication logs. Every time humans offered to help with diplomatic crises, they were told their involvement was unnecessary. We considered them too young, too inexperienced, too emotional for serious diplomatic work." The truth was becoming clearer and more painful with each revelation. While the Council had been dismissing humans as junior partners, the humans had been quietly preventing disasters that could have torn the galaxy apart. "The Rimward Rebellion of 2394, Yolandra added, pulling up another file. 12 outer worlds were ready to declare independence and form their own government. The official records say they were convinced to remain by promises of increased autonomy, but these files show human agents spent months living among the rebels, understanding their real grievances, and crafting solutions that addressed their actual needs rather than what the Council thought they needed. As they studied the documents, a pattern emerged that made everyone in the room increasingly uncomfortable. The humans hadn't just been preventing obvious conflicts. They had been identifying potential problems decades in advance and quietly working to resolve them before they became crises. The devoured sector containment, Zethkari read from another file, her voice becoming quiet with dread. The nanophage swarms that consumed 17 systems before we contained them. The official record shows that Altarian technology created the containment field. But, President Mordun prompted, though his pattern suggested he already feared the answer. But this shows humans detected the nanophage threat 8 years before it became active. They tried to warn the Council repeatedly. When their warnings were ignored, they began secretly developing containment technologies. When the crisis finally erupted, they provided the solutions to the Altarians, who presented them as their own innovations. Hierarch Valketh's mechanical translator produced what might have been a coughing sound. Impossible. Our scientists developed those containment fields through years of research. Your scientists perfected them, Yelandra corrected, accessing more files. But the fundamental principles came from human research into something called cooperative nanotechnology. The humans had been studying ways to use friendly nanobots to combat hostile ones since 2385. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. The devoured sector containment was one of the Council's greatest technological achievements. Learning that it was based on human research felt like discovering that their proudest accomplishment was built on borrowed foundation. How many other crises were prevented by human intervention? President Mordun asked. I've identified 47 major conflicts that were resolved through secret human diplomacy, Veltani replied. And that's just what I've found so far. There could be many more. As if summoned by their conversation, urgent alarms began sounding throughout the chamber. A communications officer rushed to President Mordun with a priority message. Sir, we're receiving reports from the quarantine worlds. The containment systems around the Madness Nebula are showing signs of failure. Zethkari felt her blood turn cold. The Madness Nebula was one of the most dangerous phenomena in known space, a region where exposure to certain radiation frequencies caused irreversible psychological damage to most sentient species. The containment systems around it were crucial for protecting nearby shipping lanes and populated systems. What kind of failure? President Mordun demanded. The automated warning systems are malfunctioning. 3 ships have already strayed into the affected zone. The crews are showing signs of psychological breakdown. Who maintains those warning systems? Yelandra asked, though her translator carried the tone of someone who already knew the answer. Human volunteers, the communications officer replied. They were the only species that seemed immune to the nebula's effects. They've been operating monitoring stations in the danger zone for 20 years. Immune how? Hierarch Valketh demanded. Yelandra was already accessing the relevant files. According to these records, human neural patterns are naturally resistant to the specific radiation frequencies produced by the nebula. They can work in the area for extended periods without psychological damage. The monitoring stations require constant adjustment and maintenance that can only be performed on site. So without humans, the containment systems will fail. President Mordun asked. They're already failing, the communications officer confirmed. We estimate complete breakdown within 6 days. After that, the nebula's effects could spread across 4 systems, affecting over 2 billion inhabitants. The room erupted in panicked discussion. Some representatives demanded immediate evacuation of the threatened systems. Others insisted that alternative solutions could be found. But Yelandra was studying her data with growing horror. It's not just the Madness Nebula, she announced, cutting through the arguments. There are 17 different quarantine worlds, each containing different types of dangerous phenomena. Temporal anomalies, sentient viral organisms, reality-distorting crystals, hostile energy beings. All of them are maintained by human volunteers. Why humans? Veltani asked. What makes them so special? I'm beginning to understand, Yelandra replied, her compound eyes reflecting the data screens. Humans aren't just immune to these phenomena. They're adaptable to them. Their neural patterns can adjust to different types of exotic radiation, temporal distortion, psychological pressure. Most other species have specific vulnerabilities that make certain assignments impossible. Humans seem to be naturally resistant to almost everything, or naturally reckless enough to volunteer anyway, Hierarch Valketh added sourly. Maybe both, Zethkari said quietly, but the result is the same. They've been protecting us from dangers we don't even think about. New reports continue to arrive. The economic systems that humans had quietly supported were beginning to collapse. Trade networks were failing without human mediators. Research projects were stalling without human insights. Most disturbing of all, several member species were beginning to report internal conflicts that had been dormant for decades. The Soldani are experiencing civil unrest, reported another communications officer. 3 of their colony worlds are threatening succession. Impossible, President Morden declared. The Soldani have been stable for 40 years. Because humans were secretly mediating internal Soldani politics, Feltani replied, finding yet another classified file. They had diplomatic relationships with individual Soldani faction leaders. When conflicts arose, humans would suggest compromises that preserved everyone's dignity while preventing violence. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Everywhere they looked, they found evidence of human involvement in maintaining galactic stability. Not the obvious dramatic interventions that made headlines, but quiet, patient work that prevented problems from becoming crises. How did we not see this? President Morden asked, his bioluminescent patterns showing deep shame. Because they didn't want recognition, Zethkari replied, understanding finally dawning. They wanted results. Every time we excluded them from official processes, they found unofficial ways to help. Every time we told them their assistance wasn't needed, they helped anyway. They've been holding this galaxy together while we congratulated ourselves on our achievements. Outside the council chambers, emergency crews worked frantically to address growing crises. But with each passing hour, it became clearer that the problems they faced weren't temporary inconveniences. They were the first signs of a civilizational collapse that had been prevented only by human vigilance. The galaxy was learning what it had lost, and the lesson was more painful than anyone had imagined. Senior Analyst Crixandor had not slept in 4 days. The amphibian being stood before the assembled council representatives, his webbed hands trembling as he prepared to deliver what might be the most devastating report in galactic history. Around him, the emergency chamber buzzed with desperate energy as representatives struggled to comprehend the scope of the crisis they faced. The data is conclusive, Crixandor began, his voice carrying through the universal translators with carefully controlled precision. Human involvement in galactic civilization was not merely significant, it was foundational. Without their contributions, our current level of technological and social development would have been impossible. He activated the main display, showing a complex web of interconnected systems spanning the entire galaxy. Blue lines represented trade networks, green showed communication links, red indicated security systems, and yellow marked research collaborations. Nearly 70% of the connections were highlighted in orange. Orange represents systems that depended on direct human involvement, Crixandor explained. As you can see, removing human participation doesn't just affect isolated areas. It causes cascade failures throughout the entire galactic infrastructure. Ambassador Zethkari studied the display with growing horror. The network looked like a living organism, and the orange highlights showed that humans had been its circulatory system. Give us specifics, President Morden demanded, his bioluminescent patterns flickering with stress. Medical technology, Crixandor began, pulling up detailed charts. 78% of breakthrough treatments in the past 50 years originated from human research. Not modifications or improvements, original discoveries. The regenerative medicine that saved the Velnathi from the Red Plague, human research. The neural interface technology that allows the Etherians to interact with solid matter, human innovation. The genetic therapy that extended Zetnathi lifespans by 300 years, human development. But those technologies were developed by our finest institutions, protested Councillor Framdeck of the Science Collective. Using human research as their foundation, Crixandor replied, accessing another file. The humans freely shared their discoveries with all species. Your institutions built upon their work, often without acknowledging the source. In many cases, the original human researchers specifically requested that credit be given to the institutions they were helping, rather than to themselves. The weight of that revelation settled over the chamber. The medical advances that many species considered their greatest achievements had been gifts from a species they had dismissed as primitive. Transportation and exploration, Crixandor continued relentlessly. 90% of stable hyperspace routes were mapped by human explorers. The quantum navigation systems we all depend on, human mathematics. The safety protocols that prevent ships from being lost in dimensional storms, human engineering. They were reckless explorers, Hierarch Valketh protested weakly. They took unnecessary risks. They took risks that others couldn't or wouldn't take, Crixandor corrected. Human physiology is uniquely resistant to the psychological effects of hyperspace exposure. They could explore regions that would drive other species insane. Every major trade route in the galaxy exists because humans were willing to risk their lives mapping it. Yelandra had been quietly accessing her own research files during Crixandor's presentation. Now she stood, her compound eyes reflecting data streams that made her translator buzz with electronic distress. "It's worse than we thought," she announced. "I've been analyzing human cultural contributions to galactic society. The impact goes beyond technology and exploration." She activated a secondary display showing cultural and artistic networks across the galaxy. The great opera houses of Andromeda Station haven't performed in 6 days. Their entire repertoire was composed by human artists working in collaboration with other species. The interspecies games have been cancelled, indefinitely. Humans were the only ones who could create fair competition rules for species with completely different physical capabilities. Art and games are luxuries, Hierarch Valketh dismissed. "We can survive without them, can we?" Yelandra challenged. "The philosophical frameworks that govern council law were developed by human ethicists. The moral principles that prevent us from enslaving less advanced species, human philosophy. The economic theories that allow fair trade between species with completely different resource needs, human economists working with alien partners." President Morden's bioluminescent patterns had shifted to deep purple, a color that indicated profound distress among his species. "Are you saying that our entire civilization is built on human foundations?" "Not built on," Crixandor replied carefully. "Built with. The humans never tried to dominate or control. They contributed their knowledge freely, worked collaboratively with all species, and seemed content to let others receive credit for their contributions. They were partners in the truest sense. Partners we didn't recognize," Zethkari added bitterly. As if summoned by the conversation, emergency alerts began flooding the chamber. The crisis reports had been arriving steadily for days, but now they came in an unstoppable stream. "The orbital cities of New Thessia are experiencing cascading power failures," announced one communications officer. "Their fusion reactors are overloading without human maintenance protocols." "Biodome collapse on Kepler 442c," reported another. "The ecosystem is failing without human terraforming specialists." "Piracy incidents have increased by 400%, came a third report. "The Ravager clans are attacking merchant convoys in previously secure sectors." But the most chilling report came from the deep space monitoring stations. "Containment breach detected at the devoured sector. Nanophage swarms are spreading beyond the original quarantine zone." The chamber fell silent. The devoured sector was supposed to be completely contained. The nanophage swarms that had consumed 17 systems 20 years ago were meant to be permanently imprisoned behind energy barriers. "How is that possible?" President Mordoon demanded. "The containment system requires constant adjustment," Crixandor replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "The nanophages continuously evolve, finding new ways to attack the barriers. Human technicians have been making real-time modifications to the containment field for 2 decades, staying one step ahead of the swarm's adaptations. And now there are no human technicians," Yelandra concluded. "The containment will fail completely within 72 hours, the monitoring officer reported. "At current expansion rates, the nanophages will reach inhabited systems within 6 days." Panic erupted throughout the chamber. Representatives began shouting demands, suggestions, and accusations. Some called for immediate evacuation of threatened systems. Others insisted that solutions could be found. A few began openly blaming humans for creating a system that couldn't function without them. "Order," President Morden bellowed, slamming his energy staff repeatedly. "We need solutions, not recriminations." "There is one possibility," Crixandor said quietly, his words cutting through the chaos. "I've been analyzing the human evacuation patterns. The precision of their departure suggests extensive planning. They didn't just leave, they prepared for this exact situation." "Explain," President Morden demanded. Every human facility I've examined was evacuated in perfect order. Nothing was destroyed, but specific items were removed. Technical manuals, research data, cultural artifacts. They took exactly what they needed to maintain their civilization elsewhere. So they're still alive somewhere, Zethkari realized. More than that, Crixandor continued. I found fragments of encrypted data and abandoned human computers. Most of it is unbreakable, but I managed to decode small portions. There are references to something called Project Diaspora and coordinates for a location outside known space. They planned this, Veltani breathed, her energy form flickering with understanding. They knew this would happen. They knew we would take them for granted, Yelandra agreed. They knew we would dismiss their contributions until it was too late. The implications hung heavy in the chamber. The humans hadn't just left. They had taught the galaxy a lesson about appreciation and partnership. A lesson that was costing billions of lives as critical systems failed throughout known space. Can we contact them? President Morden asked desperately. Unknown, Crixandor replied, but given the systematic nature of their departure, I suspect they left us a way to reach them. We just have to be worthy of using it. Outside the council chambers, the galaxy continued its slide toward chaos. But inside, for the first time since the crisis began, representatives were beginning to understand what they had lost and what they might need to do to get it back. 6 months after the humans vanished, Ambassador Zethkari stood in what had once been the Grand Assembly Chamber. Half the seats were empty now. 3 member species had fallen to crises that humans had been quietly preventing. The proud Vilnathi Empire faced extinction as their star showed dangerous signs of instability, a problem human astrophysicists had been secretly monitoring and preparing to solve for decades. The remaining representatives sat in stunned silence as President Mordoon delivered the final damage report. His once brilliant bioluminescent patterns had dimmed to barely visible flickers, showing the exhaustion that affected them all. The quarantine worlds have suffered complete containment failures, he announced, his voice carrying the weight of civilizational collapse. The nanophage swarms have consumed 4 systems. The Madness Nebula's effects now cover 12 worlds. The reality distortions from the Crystal Gardens have begun affecting space-time in 3 sectors. Counselor Yelandra added her own grim statistics. Economic collapse is accelerating. Without human-mediated trade networks, commerce has dropped by 80%. Food shortages are reported on 47 worlds. Medical supplies are critically low on over 100 planets. The Insectoid Collective has withdrawn from the Council entirely, added Veltani, her energy form flickering weakly. The Suldani Colonial Rebellion has spread to 7 worlds. The Etherians are retreating to their home nebula and refusing all contact. Each report was another nail in the coffin of galactic civilization. Everything they had built, everything they had achieved was crumbling without the foundation they had never recognized. How long do we have? President Morden asked. At current rates of failure, complete governmental collapse within 6 weeks, Crixandor replied. But the real question is whether we'll survive long enough to see it. The Ravager clans are only 3 days from reaching the core worlds. The Ravager clans, pirates and raiders who had been contained by human security operations for decades. Without human-operated patrol networks and early warning systems, the barbarian fleets had grown bold enough to attack major population centers. We could surrender to them, suggested one of the remaining Altarian representatives. Accept subordinate status in exchange for protection. You mean slavery? Zethkari said flatly. The Ravagers don't negotiate. They conquer. As if to emphasize her point, emergency alarms began wailing throughout the station. A communications officer rushed into the chamber with the latest crisis report. Mayday signals from the Zethnathi homeworld. The officer gasped. Ravager fleets have entered the system. They're demanding complete surrender within 6 hours. The chamber erupted in desperate discussion. Some representatives called for immediate military response. Others suggested evacuation. A few simply sat in stunned silence, overwhelmed by the scope of the disaster. Then every communication device in the chamber activated simultaneously. The screens flickered, displaying the same image across every channel, every frequency, every communication network in known space. The signal bore encryption signatures that were unmistakably human, codes that were supposed to be impossible to break. The image resolved into a simple transmission room. Behind a plain desk sat a middle-aged human woman with graying hair and kind eyes. She wore no uniform, carried no symbols of rank, yet somehow commanded immediate attention. "People of the galaxy," she began, her words translating perfectly into every known language. "My name is Director Sarah Chen of the Human Colonial Administration. I am speaking to you from our new home beyond the Galactic Rim." The chamber fell absolutely silent. Even the emergency alarm seemed to quiet in response to the transmission. "We know that our departure has caused significant difficulties," Director Chen continued. "This was not our intention, but it was inevitable. For 50 years, we tried to be partners in galactic civilization. We offered our knowledge, our skills, our lives in service of the greater good. But partnership requires mutual respect, and respect requires recognition." Her voice remained calm, but Zethkari could hear the pain beneath the diplomatic words. "We were told we were too young, too primitive, too emotional for important responsibilities. When we offered solutions to problems, we were dismissed. When we prevented crises, others took credit. When we asked for meaningful participation in governance, we were given symbolic positions with no real authority. You made us into servants," she continued, "and then convinced yourselves that servants were all we could ever be. You measured our worth by your standards while ignoring the value we brought. You took our contributions for granted while dismissing our potential." The transmission paused, and for a moment the only sound in the chamber was the distant rumble of failing life support systems. "We didn't leave out of anger," Director Chen resumed. "We left because we realized that our presence was preventing you from learning to value what you had. As long as we remained to solve your problems, you would never understand how much you depended on collaboration." "But we were wrong," interrupted President Morden, his desperation overriding diplomatic protocol. "We understand now. We need you. The galaxy needs you." As if she could hear him, Director Chen smiled sadly. "We hope you've learned, President Morden. We truly do. Because despite everything, we still care about the galaxy we helped build." The image shifted, showing star charts with a single set of coordinates highlighted. "If you've learned to value partnership over dominance, if you're willing to work with us as equals rather than treating us as useful subordinates, you can find us here," Director Chen announced. "But understand, we will not return to being taken for granted. We will not accept symbolic positions while doing real work. We will not pretend that inequality is partnership. The choice is yours. You can continue trying to maintain your civilization alone, or you can join us in building something better. But if you choose to find us, come as partners, not as masters seeking servants." The transmission shifted one final time, showing a stunning view of a new world. Green continents under alien skies, vast cities that seemed to grow organically from the landscape, ships of elegant design that moved like living things through atmosphere and space. "This is what we've built in 6 months of true freedom," Director Chen said. "Imagine what we could accomplish together as genuine equals. The coordinates will remain active for 30 days. After that, we'll assume you've made your choice." The transmission ended, leaving the chamber in profound silence. For long minutes, nobody spoke. The weight of the message, the obvious prosperity of human civilization, the clear ultimatum, it all combined to create a moment of perfect clarity about their situation. "They're offering us salvation," Veltani finally whispered. "No," Zethkari corrected, understanding flooding through her. "They're offering us partnership. Real partnership. The kind we should have offered them 50 years ago." "The coordinates are in hostile space," Crixandor observed, studying the star charts. 3 months' journey through uncharted regions. We'd have to risk everything just to reach them. As opposed to certain death if we stay here, President Morden pointed out. The debate that followed was unlike any in Council history. For the first time, representatives spoke not as members of superior species graciously tolerating inferior ones, but as desperate survivors hoping to join something greater than themselves. Some argued that seeking out the humans would be admitting failure. Others pointed out that failure had already been thoroughly demonstrated. A few suggested that humanity's terms were too harsh, but they were quickly reminded that the alternative was extinction. All in favor of dispatching a delegation to the human coordinates? President Morden finally called. Every remaining representative raised their hand, appendage, or energy projection in agreement. As emergency crews prepared the fastest ships available for the desperate journey, Zethkari found herself thinking about the lesson humanity had taught them. Sometimes the most important things in life were the ones you only noticed when they were gone. Sometimes the best partners were the ones you had been taking for granted. The galaxy had learned to appreciate what it had lost. Now it would discover whether that appreciation had come in time to save what remained, and whether it was enough to earn a second chance at genuine partnership. Outside Concordia Prime, the ships of the Council fleet prepared for the most important journey in galactic history. Not as conquerors or colonizers, but as refugees seeking sanctuary, and perhaps, if they were fortunate, as partners seeking to rebuild what they had helped destroy through indifference. The humans had given them 30 days to decide. Zethkari hoped it would be enough time to prove they had finally learned the value of what they had lost.